I just think before we start, this novel of Laura's is this rebellious, cunning exploration of what it's like within the therapist's room, but it's just an exploration of so much more: female sexuality, power dynamics, and we're going to cover so many aspects of this book. So thank you for joining us. And before Laura reads a section that will give you a sense of who Natalia is and what her afflictions are, I'm going to ask one question, Laura, and that is, your previous novels have been preoccupied with themes like adoption and death. And I'm wondering what made this the right time to explore sexual obsession.
Okay, hi everybody. It's nice to be here. It's midnight in Helsinki, so I'm caffeine-filled right now. Good question. I think that I want to search the essential human issues like death and desire, reproduction, and love, of course. So it's not so different from the previous novels, but maybe Natalia, now that I look at it in retrospective, maybe it embodies something of the Me Too movement as well. I started to write it year before the Me Too movement flared up, but some questions were on the air, I could say, very loud, and something is now inscribed in this book that Me Too movement pulled out. So perhaps something like that.
Well, another question before you read, because it's so interesting. There are two characters in your novel: a therapist who you don't assign a gender to. We never quite know what the gender is of the therapist, and we'll get to that later, and Natalia. And which character came first? I'm just imagining if the Me Too movement, well, this was prior to the Me Too movement, but there, as a female yourself, and this protagonist is very much exploring issues about femininity. Did Natalia come to you first as a character, or did this therapist come to you first who wanted to explore that part in someone else?
Absolutely, Natalia came first. And she was, in the start, a little bit abstract voice in my head. But absolutely, she did have a story to tell, but she didn't want to tell it directly. So I needed to invent a narrator who would ask questions to her and spend a lot of time with her and make her open little by little to reader. But it was Natalia who was fascinating me.
Well, how about you read one of the first few pages of the novel and set it up in any way you'd like to, because she's just the most unique character, and we'll all listen to why.
Yes, thanks. I'm going to read a short, about 5 minutes passage from the second chapter of the novel. And there Natalia tells in front of therapist what she thinks her problem is first time. And so Natalia began to tell me what was bothering her. Her lovers were the most vexatious of her problems, just as they were the very salt of her life, the sugar, the marzipan, the umami. They are gone, but they are still in my head, she said. They are gone in the most profound sense, though they are with me, inside me even. The more I kiss them, the less they are there. And then they are gone again. They walk out the door. They go to work, to their homes, their wives, their dogs. My brain starts to conjure up all kinds of situations in which I place them. Of course, I place myself in these situations too. I am always there, right in the center, and they press inside me through all possible orifices. And I feel myself filling up, but it never ends, and my head starts to ache. And there is no room inside me for a single sensible progressive thought, because my head is full of all these lovers who are now gone. There is no room in me for information. I can't learn anything. I just become stupider by the day because my lovers are blowing away inside me. And soon I will lose my mind. I carry out my own work with all the lanterns extinguished, as it were, and soon the day will come when my boss will notice everything. I interrupted her to ask what she did for a living. She told me she was one of a team of 5 graphic designers at a mid-sized PR company. Her job was to visually enhance the client's core message, and she loved her work. She wanted to develop herself both professionally and primarily in her private life to improve herself, but her imagination and her firmly held resolutions were galloping in the opposite directions. That was why she had come to me. I imagine my boss creeping up behind me and noticing that my mouse hand isn't touching the mouse at all. He doesn't grab me and shake me awake in that boss-like manner of his. And he certainly doesn't thrust his hands beneath my arms to lift me onto the desk and lay me down on my stomach. The whole idea is impossible, senseless. After all, we are in an open plan office. My boss has never abused his position of power. He doesn't tuck my skirt up or pull down my tights and panties, after which he doesn't drop his pants to his ankles. This series of movements is far too complicated now that I'm trying to explain it. But let's assume for a moment that we are naked from the waist down, my boss and I, me with my stomach on the desk and he behind me. The office around us is darkened. The phones have stopped ringing, and the employees have disappeared. My boss stands behind me, his large, hard member against my open, moist pudenda, and then nothing. I repeat, nothing. In my mind, I darken the office further still. Like a magician, I make the people disappear. The sounds of work stop until there is only this strange, heavy breathing behind me. Let's add that too. You understand. I think about sex all the time. That is my problem. The act forces its way into my mind like a tumor, and I am lost. I have contemplated chemical castration, anti-androgens. I've even considered suicide. I know in theory what constitutes a healthy sex life, what a healthy relationship is like. But I'm able to use those insights about as well as I can play the piano. That's right, I haven't got an ear for music. I experience everything, literally everything, as images. And I don't know what to do with my lovers who are absent when they are present and present when they are absent. And that's why I've come here. You are my last hope. Help me.
Thank you. So I think we can all get a sense of the desperation in which she's coming to this therapist. And so why has she chosen this specific person to try and help her? If this person is her last chance, what is special about this therapist in particular?
Well, there is one kind of mystery, and it is a painting in the wall of the therapy room. And it is in the first chapter that Natalia says to therapists that, hey, this painting has been in my grandmother's living room. So she knows the artwork that is there, And of course, the therapist keeps thinking, okay, is this the reason she has come there? But it is a big question, a little bit like thriller. What motivates her to find help from this particular therapist?
And once the therapist finds out that she has this connection to the painting, that the therapist is very perturbed and a little worried about the mental state of the woman that is writing. I keep having to say in front of him or her, but maybe that is a good place to ask. I will come back to the painting, but the gender of the therapist, it's obviously a very precise choice of yours. And what were you trying to play with in terms of the power dynamics that come with certain genders in a therapy-patient relationship?
If the therapist were, for example, male, then I think that most of the readers would think that, okay, this is a setup for a sexual relationship. That is very cliched and stereotyped description when you have a patient and a therapist and one is woman and one is man. So I make this, I have put these things inside the novel that maybe reader starts to think there has to be some confrontation, sexual desire flaming up, but I don't give it to the reader. So I think that it's very important that the reader finds his or her own stereotyped ideas on what is sexuality. Is it heterosexuality? They put something into the narrator, and I want to mix everything and make them think again what is going on there.
Well, I assumed that the therapist was a male in the beginning, and I had to question, why would I think that automatically? And then Hermione Hobie at the New York Times, who so beautifully reviewed your book, she said, well, obviously the therapist was female. So I thought, it's so interesting. You can almost read the book in two different ways if you put your mind in, either gender. And then everything Natalia says has a very different, it lands very, very differently.
Yes.
I love. So it's almost like two novels in one.
Yes, actually, this happened in Finland when one reader told me that it was she read first it like, okay, the narrator must be a man. And then she wasn't sure anymore. And after reading the whole book, she started to reading again and thought, okay, narrator is a woman. And finally, she said that she has read two different books. And that is interesting.
It's wonderful. Well, so Natalia comes to this therapist. What type of therapy does this therapist do? Because we need to say that the therapist is an unreliable narrator in themselves, and we'll dive into that idea as well. But specifically, what is the therapy based upon?
Yes, it's I call it, and the therapist call it layer therapy, and there is no layer therapy, I think, in real life. So it's my invention, but it combines, of course, the old school psychoanalysis, starting from Natalia is laying on the couch in the sessions and talks when she's lied down. So this is a psychoanalytic part of the therapy. And then different kind of art therapy forms are included. Natalia makes a lot of exercises where she reads a book or poem and makes something else out of it. But she does other things too. She makes a film, she draws pictures and makes a performance. So this layer therapy form is open to innovations and creations. It's not a specific method, but writing is very important part of it. Natalia writes stories and then kind of tells them in the therapy room.
Well, coming back to this idea of that unreliable narrative, because I'm thinking of the therapy room as a space. So usually you think of someone, you know, if you go to therapy, you always think that your stories are up for interpretation. And actually there's always a moment where you think, shall I invent? Shall I, like, our own experience of our own lives is also an invention of our own. So the patient is kind of inherently unreliable.
Yeah.
But in this case, why did you want the therapist to be unreliable as well?
That is an interpretation, of course, if it's unreliable or not. But I think that the therapist is really hiding some motivations that they don't say it aloud. And because the therapist tries here in the novel to be very, very professional and ethical, and they say it aloud so many times that it raises some suspects.
Well, and this therapist wasn't allowed into the Finnish Association of Psychoanalysts, and that's a red flag, kind of very early. Oh, well, I'm wondering if your own experiences of therapy have informed the novel. I have had one experience where I had an exercise. Someone asked me to do an exercise with non-dominant hand therapy. It was like recalling a childhood memory, but to try and write about it with the hand, your non-dominant hand. And the frustration in that is meant to, I think, tap into other types of memories and emotions, which I found fascinating. So I'm wondering if any of these exercises that you made up for Natalia, you had experienced or that you tweaked yourself?
I have experience only in classical psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies. So this kind of rehearsals or exercises I have not done. And actually, I don't have many friends with whom I have talked about. It's very classical therapy we go into, but this I have made up from my mind.
Well, I'd love to come back to this painting that does form such a significant part of the novel, and it's called Ear Mouth. And there's something very visceral about that, the idea of kind of dismembered body parts in this painting, particularly for Natalia, who has such a sexual appetite, and it's often, you know, she can speak so boldly or clearly about experience she's had based upon just a prompt like an arm or legs or heads. So how then does this painting with this title, Ear Mouth, which obviously we never see, but we can imagine, how is that significant to the novel and at the heart of it? Why this?
Yes. I was very strong ideas about that in any countries where you translate the book, the ear mouth shouldn't be illustrated in the cover because it is depicted very carefully inside the novel. And I really want that reader can imagine the painting with her own imagination or his own imagination. But the ear mouth is David Haxton's translation of Paul Valéry, who is the French author. He had made a text about bouche-oreille, which is the translation of ear mouth. And Paul Valéry, he died in 1948, so he's passed long ago. And he wanted to illustrate with the word of bouche-oreille. He wanted to illustrate the problem of communication. And his argument was that if the communication goes only inside the head, from one ear to one mouth, there around the head, then nothing develops. And that is the idea of the painting as well. There is a key how to solve this problem, and it is writing hand. It is explained quite in detail also in the book, the kind of philosophy of the ear mouth and the ideas behind of it.
I really tried to imagine that painting for myself, so I'm so thrilled that you didn't illustrate it. Mm-hmm. But there are illustrations in the book, and I'll share a quick story because it's so fabulous. A colleague was asking, I love how I'm like, oh, my story is fabulous, but you'll see. I was sharing, a colleague was asking on a Zoom work scenario like this, and with it out of company people too, said, what are you reading lately? And I said, I am reading the most outrageous novel. And I said, it's here. And then I quickly turned to this one illustration that's very graphic, and without even thinking about it, showed everyone on the Zoom, which in hindsight, we all know now, I could be cancelled in a second and HR would be called and the rest of it. But it was kind of one of those magic moments that everyone was okay with it. But all this is to say, as a reader, there is a shocking moment, which is you kind of either laugh out loud or it takes your breath away and you go, she did it. Like all the rules are off, I'd love you to talk about why. We don't want to ruin what the image is, and there are some other illustrations in the book as well. But why was it important to include these exercises that Natalia did, in a visual form that wasn't just the prose?
Yeah, I'm very interested in images, and I also, but when I write, it's very visual to me. And I think that it was just a logical step in my career to put real images inside the novel. And of course, I felt kind of feeling that, wow, this can be read as a feminist novel. And then there is this picture, which is very, very photographic, I could say. So there is maybe some kind of contradiction about the message, or if there is some, and the Natalia's kind of, she wants to shock people. She wants to shock the therapist as well. So I think that it's good to have it. The reader gets the shock as well as the therapist when they see this picture. It comes just like a surprise to them, even as for the reader.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting you talk about how Natalia is shameless, and she's shameless in a lot of the scenarios that she recounts, her sexual kind of experiences with many men. But it seems like as the therapy goes on, a lot of the source of her anguish comes from shame and from childhood shame. And I'm wondering if you can connect what you were trying to explore about shame and then adult shamelessness.
Well, shame is a very informed feeling, I think. It's spread around your whole body, and you feel, when you are ashamed of something, you feel pain inside of you, but normally maybe you even don't know exactly where it comes from. You have an idea, but it's very hard to show it comes directly from this point. So it spreads around your body and mind and takes everything out of you. It's so strong feeling. And Natalia, where she is in the therapy room, she's very many times totally shameless. And I think that it is because of the power of storytelling. When you tell a story, you put frames to a thing you are trying to describe, and then you have some control over it. So one could say that the therapy room is a place for Natalia and her stories, where she can kind of take her shame and feel a little bit more pain.
I hadn't thought of it like that. I'm just taking that in. I was thinking, because there are examples in the book of where Natalia shares a childhood experience where she felt shame. And I think when we think about our own childhoods, and when like you just said, it's a feeling. And obviously when you're a child, you don't have language. You don't even know what shame, the word, means. I still find it hard to kind of locate shame, but it's a feeling. And how do these instances in Natalia's childhood, particularly like around sexuality, how do they play out in her later life? Like, can you make a connection to like a moment of shame in childhood with her sexual needs that come out later on?
When the book starts, Natalia tells these shocking stories, some of which derive from her childhood. But the therapist who tries to interpret it, and Natalia, tries to drive her into her the Oedipal schema between what happens between a young child and mother and father. And there is one crucial passage or chapter where Natalia tells a story that is like a what is the word in English, but it is Freudian, the scène primitive, a primal scene, where a child sees the intercourse of her parents. And it is something in the book, again, very Freudian idea that then this is the place where a child cannot go into. It is something that doesn't belong to her, the lust that her parents feel to each other. She is outsider of that desire. And it can be traumatic. And if it's not kind of confronted well in the family, it can go to a trauma level. That is one kind of psychoanalytic interpretation of all the traumas. But it is inside the book as well, a description of audible trauma.
Thinking of the therapist now, there are many moments where he or she, the therapist, feels like they might have lost control of these sessions. And we're coming back to power dynamics again, less so about gender now, but what happened? Why was it important to capture that, the give and take of energy in a room between two people, where one person is meant to hold the ultimate power? But Natalia, why is she fighting? Or is she fighting? Or is it a game for her?
There can be different interpretations, which of course I want the reader be free to interpret the book differently. But for me, Natalia represents a feminine rebellion force against the therapist interpretations, which try to capture Natalia and put her into her place. And Natalia is fighting against these interpretations. She's always doing something else in the therapy room and trying to surprise the therapist. So there are two forces, like one is interpreting and other is escaping. And these two forces collapse together in the novel and make the narrational dynamics maybe into it.
I'm thinking too of there's a moment in the book where the therapist says to Natalia, you know, you've obviously read these books that are known to kind of be the canon about female sexuality, like Madame Bovary or Venus in Furs. And Natalia kind of rolls her eyes as if to say, like, that's so cliche. How, like, surely you can come up with more than that. But I'm wondering, because you study the novel as well and the history of literature as well, I think we are being lazy when we rely on these texts. There are so many more, and I feel like your book becomes part of that, the conversation around female sexuality. Do you feel, I'm interested, like, as Laura, do you feel like you roll your eyes when someone says, oh, you've obviously read those texts that tell us all about, you know, women's carnal desires?
Some of the texts are good. I actually happen to like Madame Bovary as well. And the therapist, what they do in the novel, they ask Natalia to rewrite some classical text with her own imagination and own memories and stuff like that. But she refuses, as you said. And that is a good question. Does she want to put all the tradition behind her? But of course, we need to think and rethink again the themes and write them. Every writer generation needs to do it, I think.
Well, while you're writing this book, and you'll have to tell us where you are, you're simultaneously completing a PhD. And can you tell us about the French writer that you're studying and how she upended the novel? You're going to do a much better way of explaining it, but wondering how and if her work has inspired you to completely buck tradition and push the novel to a new place.
This is a huge question. I could talk about Natalia Is Shameless for hours, but I try to keep myself short here. Yes, I have studied Natalia Is Shameless and make a dissertation on her poetics almost 18 years now, which is a very long period of time. And it has had so many different stages. For example, I wrote one version of my dissertation in French just to find out that it was over 200 pages, just to find out that, okay, I can't defend my thesis in that foreign language. So I came back to Finnish language. So I have spent so many years with Natalia Is Shameless, whom I love and hate at the same time. And because the book is titled My Friend Natalia, it's quite obvious that Natalia Is Shameless has something to do with the novel. And one thing is that even though Natalia Is Shameless explored all the aspects of human mind, the microscopic movements of human mind, there was one single theme that she cut off from her all her work, and it is the sexual desire. That is lacking in her monumental oeuvre altogether. So I thought that, okay, before I accomplish my dissertation, I want to make a novel as a homage to Natalia Is Shameless and put the sexuality inside of it.
What do you know about her sexuality from all your research? Do you think it's obviously a very conscious choice to omit that?
I think that many researchers have said that, okay, there is a desire, but it is in Natalia Is Shameless' work, but it's on the level of metaphors and very bodily metaphors. But between people, for example, man and a woman, husband, a wife, there is always just trouble and problems and fights. So I think that one could say that her world view on humans is a bit pessimistic, but I don't think so. She investigates those micro movements she calls tropism, which is instinct reactions to other people, and tries to put them into words. What inspires me in Natalia Is Shameless is that she has gone further than anyone else before her or after her, I think, to understand the human consciousness. She went much further than Virginia Woolf and the other modernists. So that inspires me endlessly. How further you can go.
And when can we read what you have to say about her?
My idea is that theme of my dissertation is the problem of communication. So I try to recontextualize her poetics. Because she is very research author. There is many meters of research on Natalia Is Shameless, and that means that I really have to find my own spot where from I do my things. And I can't take old philosophers like Henri Bergson, Paul Valéry, to communicate with Natalia Is Shameless in my work. So it is like an open table to different thinkers and philosophers to come to discuss about human mind.
Oh my goodness. Well, you just mentioned that you obviously speak and write in French, and your book has been published in, across the world in many, many languages, but obviously the French and English are versions that you can read and understand. And I'm wondering if Natalia has a slightly different personality in each language. Who's the Finnish Natalia? I feel like she might have the sense of humor might come across like sharply in Finnish. How does she change a little bit? And are you okay with those different, slightly, amorphous versions of her?
Yeah, different Natalias in different countries. I love the idea because I think that the book is the translation, it's different artwork. It's the art of the translator. And David Haxton has done so brilliant work that I just admire his skills. And the French translation is made by Claire Saint-Germain, and it will be out from Gallimard next autumn. And I feel that there is a different kind of rhythm, of course, and the language with its own rhythms and sense of words creates different persons. It's never only what is said, but how it is said and how the language sounds and feels when you see it. So even the very microscopic level of language, it changes Natalia. I'm sure about that.
Because there's definitely a playfulness to her, what I love about her as well is that there is a passion and enthusiasm. She's not cynical, which I think often if you read about, women who are obsessed with sex or, there can be something, cynical or sad, or they're just such bad words I'm using to describe the complexity, but there is an effervescence to her, and maybe that's because when she goes into that space, she's almost on a high, isn't she? Because she's waited all week. She's done her homework. She's waited all week, and this is what comes across, is that she's there and she's ready to perform and be a good performer, and the therapist better not get in her way.
That's true. She's at the same time, she's totally innocent, as you said, and she plays games. So there's a combination of innocence and this tricky person. And one could say that before she might have these obsessions on sexuality, which she tells in the novel to therapist, but little by little, the writing exercises and art exercises, and the fact that she's going to see the therapist and reveal herself, I think that it takes the place from the sexual desire, and the storytelling becomes a seduction in the novel, in a way.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that, and that might be kind of an obvious theme, but I want to quickly throw it out to people who are listening to formulate a question, or do let us know if you have a question, because we don't have too much time left and it's just so ripe for questioning. So either, place it in the chat or let us know, but we can keep the conversation going otherwise.
I had a question about the translation, and you have admiration for this English translation, and I was just wondering how collaborative or not that was. Were you able to get looks at certain passages of the book, and what that felt like? I mean, this isn't your first time being translated, but what was that experience like working with David?
Yes, I have read all the translation and communicated with David and with the Norton editors about the book, and I have spent a lot of time because if there are two languages I can read and it's English and French, then I really want to read the translation first and have discussions with the translators. Yes, it feels I feel very privileged that I can go in these two languages and get a sense of the world that is a bit, as Angela said, it's a bit different. Absolutely, it's hugely different from the Finnish original. Natalia feels a bit different person when you read it from French or English. So it opens the world a little bit wider to me.
And were there any, you talked a little bit about your philosophical readings and your research, but were there any works of fiction that you found particularly instructive, maybe for any problems you might have had in originally writing the book? I can't think of many books that, I can think of famous fictional therapists, and I can think of movies with therapists as characters, but I can't think of one as sort of, not myopic, but one so focused on the relationship. Was there any writers, fiction writers, that were helpful?
Yeah, of course, there is a so-called bookshelf in the end of the book where I put, it's a Natalia's bookshelf, and there are listed some works which have been inspiration for the novel. But one American author, of course, quite obvious, is Philip Roth and Portnoy's Complement. It's totally about sexuality and very male sexuality. And the whole book is a monologue, narrator's monologue to therapist. So that could be a very, very masculine historical counterpart for this, My Friend Natalia, which is totally feminine version of the patient speaking about the sexuality to therapist.
I have a question here from Bethan. He says, storytelling as seduction is as old as Scheherazade, yet at the same time it never gets old. What is your favorite example of seductive storytelling?
Ooh, there are so many, but I have been very many times speaking. It's not storytelling, but it is telling. Maggie Nelson's books I really love, because they are philosophical and accessible at the same time, And when I read Maggie Nelson's books, they have been now translated widely into Finnish, so I can be in contact with my own mother language, with Maggie's ideas. I feel that, and this is very rare feeling with me when I read, because I'm a very skeptical reader, I feel that I'm in the same mental place and communicating with her.
Yeah, I was just thinking of I think the beginning of Bluets is just, suppose I were to say I fell in love with a color. So there's seduction there, and it just brings you in. That's fantastic. I could listen to the two of you talk for another hour. That was really wonderful. And I hope everybody, I'm going to post it into the chat again, will get their copy of My Friend Natalia from McNally Jackson. And I want to read the rest of, how many novels in French have you written?
Oh, how many novels in French? All of the Natalie Sarraut's works, of course.
And how many are available in English?
Just my novels, you mean? Yes. Narrated and this one. I have written 3 novels altogether, and the first one is not translated yet to English. But Narrated.
Is it called Scissors?
Scissors, yes. That would be the direct translation of the name of my first novel.
Well, I hope I get a chance to read it in English soon. In the meantime, I will settle for this really, really wonderful novel, My Friend Natalia. The link to buy it from us is in the chat. Laura, Angela, thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful event. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for staying up late.
Yes, thank you for staying for us.
Go and buy this book. It's so beautiful.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.